Well, it's good to be back. I'm going to take my mask off because my glasses fog up. I'm trying to talk. Someday they'll invent glasses that don't fog. It's supposed to be these special wipes that are supposed to prevent it, but they don't work. Well, if I'm a little shaky this morning, yesterday was a big day in our family. Kathleen's oldest daughter, my oldest stepdaughter, got married. So we had a big wedding, or they had a big wedding, we were there. And I don't know what happens with weddings these days. We were just talking about this. They start early and they go late. So the festivities actually started on Thursday. It was almost like the Tridium. We had a Holy Thursday, we had dinner Thursday night, and then we had rehearsal and rehearsal dinner on Friday, and then yesterday was the wedding. So it was all good. It was great. And they're off on their honeymoon soon. So what we're going to try to do this morning and next week is talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s theology. We'll see how far we get today. So I'm not going to line out exactly where we may end up, but there are three main topics that I want to try to cover this week and next. First of all, his theology of God, and then his, to use the fancy theological term, his Christology, and then his theological anthropology, his understanding of what it means to be human. And then if we have time, depends how fast we go today, what gets left over for next week, we may do a little bit on a comparison of Dr. King and Thomas Merton in terms of kind of spirituality. So we'll see if we get to that. So why this topic? King is really known, of course, for his leadership within the modern civil rights movement that starts in the 1950s and moves really until his assassination or shortly after in 1968. But King was not simply an activist and a leader, he was also a preacher and somebody who had a PhD in theology. And he had a rich theology that often kind of gets overlooked by his activism, but it was his theology that grounded what he was doing. His faith grounded what he was doing. And I think it's helpful to look at his faith because it tells us more about Dr. King, but it also may help ground our commitments to work for a better world, to work for a better society. And God knows there's lots of work to be done. There's always lots of work to be done in every generation. But right now there might be kind of a tendency to get discouraged. And I think Dr. King's theology can give us some hope and some encouragement. And really, when we think about what it is that we're doing, when we claim to be believers, we're really saying this is the way we want life to be. In other words, God functions in our lives as a kind of symbol of what is the highest truth, the highest goodness, and the highest beauty. And so, as Paul Tillich talked about, God is our ultimate concern. If we look at how we organize our lives, that will say a lot about what we actually believe deep in our hearts, about the way the world is, about the way the universe is, and all that's tied into our understanding of God. So let's jump into King and see, and I'm going to tell sort of a story of his journey, because his theology is not systematic theology, like the kind we might pick up Karl Barth and start, and I'm sure everybody in this class, because Barth, stands in the Reformed tradition, everybody in this class has studied Barth extensively, right?
I've heard of his name before.
Yeah, you heard. Someday I'll have to do a class on Barth. He's actually a great theologian. If you read Barth or Thomas Aquinas, even Martin Luther to some extent, but these kind of systematic theologians, they start with God and they move to Christ, and It's all very orderly and well established and kind of logical order. King, of course, was not that kind of theologian. He was a person whose theology emerges from his speeches, his preaching, his activism. So we have to sort of read between the lines sometimes to sort of discern a kind of a system that's in there. And so that's why I'm going to start with his understanding of God, and we'll kind of make King into a systematic theologian, which is probably not a good thing to do. But I'm going to do that by telling his story. So King is raised in a fundamentalist church. His grandfather and his father were both Baptist preachers. As a fundamentalist African-American church, but nonetheless it was fundamentalist. And in that fundamentalist church, he did learn something that was quite important for his entire life, is that as his grandmother or his mother told him, that he was as good as anyone, that he was somebody. And the church functioned as a place for King in which that somebodyness was affirmed over and over again, in the context of that God has made you in God's image. And so no matter what people might say or what people might do to you, you are somebody. But at the same time in that church, God was presented as very authoritarian, as the judge that you should fear, judge who demands obedience, submission, and kind of conformity to the respectable ways of the church. And so if you kind of think of growing up in a church where the most important thing is to be respectable, that's the kind of church that Dr. King was growing up in. And that, of course, functioned within the context of a segregated society, to protect him, because if you're being respectable, there's less respectable as an African American, there's less chance that you might get out of line in a way that might offend the white power structure. But King really kind of chafed under this religion. He didn't like it. In fact, he really was embarrassed by the kind of emotionalism as he saw it. The shouting and the stomping and the amens and all that embarrassed the young Dr. King. In fact, he wrote, I didn't understand it and it embarrassed me. And so he started moving away from that when he went to Morehouse in Atlanta. When he was 16 years old, he starts college. And then he moves even further away from it when he goes to the East Coast. So he gets out of the South, goes to the East Coast, and attends two white institutions, and not just white, but theologically liberal institutions. Crozier Theological Seminary, just outside of Philadelphia, for his Master of Divinity degree. And then he goes to Boston University, obviously in Boston, where he earns his PhD. And he's very much attracted to the kind of rationalism and philosophical depth of this liberal theology. And when you think of liberal theology, you can think of like Paul Tillich and others like him who were trying to move Christianity into the modern world and show how Christianity is compatible with the best that the modern world can offer. And, kind of trajectory, if you think about Idlewild Presbyterian Church, that's been the trajectory of Idlewild Presbyterian Church, deeply influenced by kind of liberal theology. And also this kind of attention within liberal theology in the study of Scripture to attend to the historical context and to try to figure out what the Scripture meant in its original context before trying to figure out what it might mean for us today. So folks like Rudolf Bultmann, who talked about the demythologizing of the New Testament and looking kind of for the moral and theological truth that endures sort of take it out of the primitive first century context and try to figure out what it says in our contemporary context. And so liberal theology questioned things like the virgin birth, miracles, even the resurrection get questioned within, and they questioned and sort of made into more symbols rather than like actual historical truth. So King is very attracted to this as a kind of path out of fundamentalism. And his early preaching really reflects this kind of liberal theology, and so does his dissertation. But something happens, and it's called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. So he makes a decision, which is a very important decision in his life, to become a pastor rather than a professor. King could have easily, going to have a PhD from Boston University, could have easily moved into the life of an academic, probably would have been a pretty good theologian, but he decides to follow in the footsteps of his father and his grandfather and become a pastor. And the first church where he's pastor is this little Baptist church in, if you've ever been to Montgomery, it's really interesting to see where the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church is. It is literally about a block away from the state capitol, which had been the Confederate Capitol building. So it's in the shadow of the Confederate Capitol building. That's where King becomes a pastor. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church was known as a silk stocking church. Everybody know what a silk stocking church is?
Rich people.
Yes, richer people. And so it's a very respectable place. And King there would find an audience that expected a kind of more rational, non-emotional teaching as a form of preaching, rather than getting lots of amens and whooping and all of those sorts of things. And he's young, he's in his early 20s when he assumes leadership of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And that's why he's selected by the clergy in Montgomery to lead the bus boycott, to be the spokesperson, because they were all kind of fighting like who should get this. And they decided, let's give it to him because he's new here. And so he doesn't really represent any of the kind of existing factions among the clergy. So King takes on this leadership. And as he does, of course, he is thrust right into the midst of a horrific struggle as the bus boycott is proceeding, because he's the spokesperson. He's the person who's taking on a lot of the criticism and the threats of violence that were accruing to the people who were involved with the bus boycott. So King has a kind of conversion experience. He gets a phone call late one night, and it's a person who is threatening him and his family. Bus boycott's been going on for several months. He's tired, he's discouraged, and then after this horrible phone call, he can't sleep. So he goes down to the kitchen, and I'm going to just read what he says about this. It's really a powerful story. It seemed that all of my fears had come down on me at once. I had reached the saturation point. I got out of bed and began to walk the floor. Finally, I went to the kitchen and heated a pot of coffee. I was ready to give up. I tried to think of a way to move out of the picture without appearing a coward. In this state of exhaustion, when my courage had almost gone, I determined to take my problem to God. My head in my hands, I bowed over the kitchen table and prayed aloud. The words I spoke to God that midnight are still vivid in my memory. I'm here taking a stand for what I believe is right, but now I'm afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone. That's his prayer. At that moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced him before. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, "Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for truth. I will be at your side forever." Almost at once, my fears began to pass from me. My uncertainty disappeared. I was ready to face anything. The outer situation remained the same, but God had given me inner calm. 3 nights later, our home was bombed. Strangely enough, I accepted the word of the bombing calmly. My experience with God had given me a new strength and trust. I knew that God is able to give us the interior resources to face the storms and problems of life. This was a story that King preached on many times and wrote about many times. And part of what we can see here is a move from a kind of head faith, where he had moved with liberal theology, into more of a heart faith, where, I mean, he's not leaving his head behind, as we'll see, but his heart is now in his faith as well. This is really perhaps the first time in King's life where God became not simply an idea, but a reality. And this is going to sustain him through some pretty dark and dangerous times. This is the late 1950s, and it is kind of amazing how quickly things move. But in 1968, when he gives his famous "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, you can almost hear echoes in that speech of this kitchen conversion. Those famous words, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." And of course, it was the next day that he was assassinated. So what do you hear in his conversion? What kind of God is King talking about, both in the conversion experience and in just that little snippet from the mountaintop speech? I'm going to ask folks a little questions to keep you awake.
God with you.
God with us, right? Yeah, very present God. God who is present.
God reminds me of
A God who answers prayer. Right. Go ahead, Barbara, too.
It reminds me of Alcoholics Anonymous, where you turn your life over to God, and that's very similar to what they say then.
Yeah, it's sort of, I've reached the end, right?
Yeah.
I don't have any strength, any resources of myself left. I'm totally emptied out. I've hit bottom. And yes, so there's this sense of the present God, the powerful God, and the language that he used right at the end, which he's drawing from the Black church, by the way, a God who is able. And that phrase, God who is able, is one that comes back in King's writings and preaching a lot post this kitchen conversion. So it's no longer just this kind of rationalist God, a demythologized God who is more like a sort of an abstract deity. This is now the personally, powerfully present God of more Orthodox Christianity, more like what he had experienced at its best in the African-American church that he had grown up in. So he's really moving in the direction of this God who is a sustainer in the struggle, a God who is present. Says, when you know God, you can stand up amid the agonies and burdens of life and not despair. When you know God, you have on some shoes that can help you walk through any muddy place. So he's got this great language of a God who's accompanying him along the way. And he starts to see this more personal God is really his companion, someone who is breaking bread with him, so to speak, along the way. He wrote shortly after the bus boycott, "Whatever the cause, God has been profoundly real to me in recent months. In the midst of outer dangers, I have felt an inner calm." Hear that kitchen conversion language in there? "And know resources of strength that only God could give. In many instances, I have felt the power of God transforming the fatigue of my despair into the buoyancy of hope. God is a living God. In him, there is feeling and will, responsive to the deepest yearnings of the human heart. This God both evokes and answers prayers." So this is a God who has become very real to King in his life. 6 years later, in his sermon at the funeral of the 4 little girls who were killed in the 16th Street Baptist, the bombing at the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, he said, "At times life is hard as crucible steel. But through it all, God walks with us. Never forget that God is able to lift you from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope." See, it's very similar language. "And transform dark and desolate valleys into sunlight paths of inner peace." This God then becomes the very basis and the ongoing sustaining of his leadership within the civil rights movement, and his call as part of that leadership for other people to get involved. So he starts to talk about that since God is involved in human life, then we should get on board with what God is trying to do in human life. And what he sees God as trying to do in human life, he kind of draws back from that more the liberal theological tradition of the social gospel. So he writes, "The gospel at its best deals with the whole person, the whole man, not only his soul, but his body, not only his spiritual well-being, but his material well-being. Any religion that professes to be concerned about the souls of men and is not concerned about the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them, is a spiritually moribund religion awaiting burial." So this vision of God is that this activist God is not only sustaining him in terms of his interior life, it's also shaping his sort of the exterior activist life. And he starts to draw upon this God, and he sees how this is the God of the Bible. And in that, he's kind of returning to his more fundamentalist roots, and he's saying, look, those stories about the Exodus story and the prophetic denunciations of injustice that we see in the Old Testament and in the life and teaching of Jesus, what we're seeing is a consistent story of God acting for the sake of justice. And justice, biblical justice, is that we are freed from whatever is holding us back. We're becoming fully human, and we're creating together a society in which we can all flourish as human beings. That's biblical justice. And the test of biblical justice is how the least of these is doing. So if the least in a society are doing well, then of course everybody will be doing well. So this becomes then King's theological basis. This vision of God becomes the theological basis for his critique of the white church. He writes, time and again in my travels, as I have seen the outward beauty of white churches, I have had to ask myself, what kind of people worship there? Who is their God? See that theological term? Is their God the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? See, the biblical God. And is their Savior the Savior who hung on the cross at Golgotha? Where were their voices when defiance and hatred were called for by white men who sat in these very churches? As the Negro struggles against grave injustice, most white churchmen offer pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. I always love King's language. Sanctimonious trivialities. Too much of the white church is timid and ineffectual, and some of it is shrill in its defense of bigotry and prejudice. It's a piercing analysis, but it's coming from King's experience of moderate white clergy who are always saying to the civil rights movement, you all need to slow down. You're pushing things too far, too fast. And then, of course, there's the worst folks, in a way, who are just openly opposed. It was interesting for me to find out that those clergy folks who wrote to King and that he responded to in his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, one of those guys was Nolan B. Harmon. He was a Methodist minister. And when I was at Candler School of Theology, Nolan B. Harmon was still alive and he was teaching at the seminary. It's very interesting because he's just this gentle, kind, generous person. I mean, you would have never thought that he was the guy, one of the guys who was being roundly criticized by Dr. King in the letter from Birmingham jail. And in fact, he was simply a moderate. He was a kind of typical white pastor in the South who was personally sympathetic to the civil rights movement, but knew that if he spoke out, he'd lose his job. And what good would that do? Right? It's kind of, I mean, clergy still sort of struggle with these issues of how do you prophetically call people beyond where they are when they're pretty comfortable with where they are. And if you push them too far, too fast, you're shown the door. And what did that accomplish? Because then you're not even there to prod anymore, right? So the moderates, I mean, it's not a completely unworthy position to try to take. But what King is saying is, I mean, what God do you believe in? And he's saying it not just to the clergy, of course, he's saying it to the people in the pews as well. So King's theology of God here has moved from a kind of theological liberalism that was very accommodating, or that he saw as too accommodating with the status quo, to a faith that was deeply shaped by his experience in the Black church and the civil rights movement. And if you think about it, how many sort of liberal academic theologians do you know who are actually activists? That's what he's getting at, right? So they have this like, they'll teach in fine seminaries, but are they ever in the streets? And that was, I mean, that's why King moved to be a pastor, right? Because he wanted to be more actively engaged with the church. And it's a temptation when you're in the seminary, because when you're in the seminary teaching, you're supposed to be neutral. That's what people think, at least. So when you're in the classroom, you want to present all the different sides of an argument. Well, on the one hand, this, well, on the other hand, that. And can't we figure out how everybody has a valid point? And that's not a bad approach sometimes, but if we're talking about life and death, which we were in the civil rights movement, and I think we are today in things like voting rights, then how can you just do on the one hand and on the other hand? It's kind of like when Donald Trump said there are good people on both sides, right? And I don't think Donald Trump would be comfortable with theological liberalism, but he was reflecting that kind of liberal approach. Well, there are good people on both sides. And what King is saying is, look, that's a cop-out. We're not necessarily have to judge the soul of other people. We can look at their actions and say, people are not actively seeking the good on one side. In fact, they're actively opposing it. And so we have to have the courage to say, that's wrong, and we're going to stand up against it. So what King wants to push people toward and invite people into is that the God of the Exodus, the God of the prophets, the God of Jesus does never approves of the mistreatment and the exploitation of other people. And so if that is going on, then the only place to be as a person of faith is in opposition to it and to be seeking an alternative, not to say, well, you know, they have valid points too. So with this kind of vision of God, King is also starting then to move into a sense of, okay, which direction is history going to move? And he affirms that even though it doesn't even look like it, this is kind of where his apocalyptic vision comes in. It doesn't look like on the surface of things that history is moving in a godly direction. That is in fact where it is moving. And of course, that's an important turn theologically to keep people hopeful, right? We may be in darkness right now, but where we're headed, there's the light. And in fact, God is going to make sure that we get there. And that's why King could assert, today we know with certainty that segregation is dead. You know, he's saying that in 1964. It didn't look dead. Doesn't really look completely dead right now in some respects. But he's saying, we know with certainty that segregation is dead. That's where we have to have that kind of confidence. We know with certainty that voting rights are going to be affirmed. And then we act upon that certainty. We don't say, oh, geez, I don't know if we can do this. We have to say, no, we can do this. And the reason we know we can do this is because, and this language can be dangerous sometimes, God is on our side. And that's not to dehumanize the opponent, but it is important for us to have that kind of vision of God, as King said, to overcome our apathy.
Well, a lot of times you have both parties that feel like God is
Yes,
on their side.
yes, they do. And that's when you can really have a great theological argument, right? Because who is your God? That's the question I like to ask myself. Well, okay, tell me a little bit more about your God. Who is your God? Who does your God stand with? Does your God stand with Pharaoh or with the Israelites? And of course, our God usually is standing with Pharaoh. That's why it's on our dollar bills, right? In God we trust. What God is that? See, it's too easy, especially if we're kind of comfortable in liberal theology, to presume that these are the same God, but they're not. That's the God of nationalism and of capitalist economics. It's that God. Do we trust in that God, or do we trust in the God of the Exodus and the Hebrew prophets and Jesus, who don't identify God with what's inscribed on a coin? Remember Jesus' little story about that? Right? Whose image is on you? And that's what King is trying to move towards, or help people move, is to see that we need to wake up and quit passively. I'm quoting him here. We cannot passively accept an unjust system, because to do that, he says, is to cooperate with that system and thereby become a participant in its evil. This is very challenging stuff, because it's much easier to passively accept an unjust system by simply cooperating with it. So he warned all of us about sleeping through a revolution. And he'd tell the story of Rip Van Winkle. Remember him? Guy who slept through the American Revolution. And he's worried. King is worried that's what the white moderates are doing. And not only the white moderates, but he was also receiving a fair amount of criticism from certain parts of the African American church as well. And if we do that, he said, if we sleep through the revolution, we're going to end up with what we deserve, which is what he's called a soulless society, a society without a soul. This is when this happens, the sense of participation is lost. I'm quoting him, the feeling that ordinary individuals influence important decisions vanishes. And this produces alienation, perhaps the most pervasive and insidious development in contemporary society. Alienation is a form of living death. It is the acid of despair that dissolves society. So he's pointing out what happens when we don't have a faith in a God who is active in our personal lives and in our public lives, and moving both personal and public life toward justice. Well, we give up. That's what happens. We despair. And Lord knows it's easy to despair when one is relatively comfortable economically. That's where there's a theologian, I can't think of her name right now, and she talks about how easy it is for those of us who are middle class to despair. Because even if we're despairing, at least we still have a comfortable place to live and we're still eating pretty well, right? And that's what King was appealing to, right? Because he knows where is political and economic power? It's with the middle class. Now, the middle class doesn't give in to despair, but rather claims the power that it already really has. Then things can change. And that's what happens when we struggle for voting rights, for example, in this instance. And do we even vote? So for King, the best antidote to this alienation and apathy is a faith in a God who is able, who acts in history, who's present with people who seek justice. This is the God who acted to liberate the Israelites, who were hopelessly enslaved in Egypt, who acted in Christ to liberate humanity when we were hopelessly enslaved to sin and death. And that means that we can't just sit back apathetically and accept the present injustice and do nothing. God is calling us to join in this work of justice. And the really fun news, the good news, is that when we enter into that work of justice more fully, we actually experience God even more deeply, as King did in his kitchen conversion. So I'm going to move now from his theology of God into his Christology, his understanding of Jesus. Where is Jesus in all of this? You can't really have a Sunday morning Bible study, Sunday morning education without talking about Jesus, right? So King sees Jesus in kind of two ways. On the one hand, Jesus is a moral exemplar. And he gets that kind of from the liberal theological tradition that he draws on. And Christ as moral exemplar does a couple of different things. First of all, Jesus calls us to be creatively maladjusted. One of King's great phrases, creatively maladjusted. And then the second thing that Jesus does is calls us to be extremists for justice. So we'll just look at those briefly, and then we'll move into the other aspect of Jesus being with us, kind of in our hearts. and standing with us as we do the struggle for justice. So King wrote that there are some things within our social order to which I am proud to be maladjusted, and to which I call you to be maladjusted. I never intend to adjust myself to segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to the tragic effects of the methods of physical violence and to tragic militarism. I call upon you to be maladjusted to such things, as maladjusted as Jesus of Nazareth, who dreamed of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. And that's an interesting phrase, because that was like the top phrase of liberal Christianity in the 1950s, the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. And you can see it needed a feminist critique, which will come in the 70s. Now, Christ as a moral extremist, so this is the next step. Christ as moral extremist is reflected in his life, in Jesus's life, that's committed to the moral extremes of love and justice. This is where he wrote, when he wrote in his letter from Birmingham jail, because the moderate liberal clergy were saying, don't be so extreme, right? Slow down. So King responded that Jesus was an extremist in love. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremist will we be? Will we be extremists for hate, or will we be extremists for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice, or will we be extremists for the cause of justice? Jesus Christ was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness. So, after all, maybe the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. So that's what he was writing to these liberal clergy. Now, in addition to Jesus being a moral model, a moral exemplar, King saw in Jesus's cross and resurrection and in Jesus's cruciform way of life the revealing of a divine path for humans to live into in order to bring in the beloved community. So it's not that Jesus is just moral exemplar. Jesus is also one that we need to be united with in our lives. We need to have Jesus in our hearts. So King wrote, the cross is an eternal expression of the length to which God is willing to go to restore broken community. The resurrection is a symbol of God's triumph over all the forces that seek to block community. So we're called to do just like Jesus did in order to bring in that beloved community. And this is where the rubber really hits the road. Jesus Christ, King said, gave his life for the redemption of this world. And as his followers, we are called to give our lives continuing the reconciling work of Christ in this world. So it's not just like a kind of good moral example, but it's also how we enter into a very challenging and indeed dangerous way of life, the way of the cross. So just what Jesus said, if you're going to be my disciple, you have to take up your cross and follow me. So what King sees that the way that Jesus goes to the very heart of what it means for us to be human beings. That if we're going to overcome evil in our own lives and in the lives of others, there's only one way to do that. And that's through the power of love. And I think I'm going to underline that because it's the way evil is overcome in our own lives and in the lives of others, which is love. But sometimes, and I'm going to talk about the personal first, because if we don't get that right, we're not going to get the political correct either. sometimes we beat ourselves up. And we think that we're going to get morally better, or we're going to become better human beings by being mean to ourselves. To hate ourselves, to be very judgmental towards ourselves. And what King is getting at is that this love is the way God loves us, which is to simply accept us for who we are. And when we experience that kind of love, we don't want to jump to this too quick, that changes us. So we don't want to get that backwards, which is we sort of try to change ourselves in order to get God's love. It's the other way around. God gives us God's love, and that love is what changes us. So King sees here, and we'll come back to this a little bit next week, is this love in political life is expressed through a nonviolent struggle for social change, which is very difficult to do because it involves us in two things. First of all, love of our enemies and the willingness to accept suffering for the sake of change. Not suffering because suffering is a good in and of itself, not bad at all. But how do we engage in political life in such a way that we take on the suffering rather than inflicting suffering on those we oppose? This is tough stuff. It's very hard. And I think about it when I see what's happening in our own country, in our political life, where there's so much hatred, and I'm going to sound like a liberal here, but being expressed by both sides. And what King was trying to do is to say the way to get to social change, to political change, to economic change is not by, just accepting the way things are, but to resist in a way that doesn't imitate the dynamics that are already present of just two sides going at each other. Or as Paul said in his letter to the Romans, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's in Romans 12 somewhere. I think it's 12:21 if I remember right. So this kind of self-giving love is what King says that we tap into, in a sense, when we enter into relationship with Jesus. That this is what Jesus is inviting us into, to love others as God has loved us. King repeats this over and over again, that unmerited suffering is redemptive. And that's something that we have to sort of chew on, I think, and it's tough to believe that. And it's tough, and since it's tough to believe it, it's also tough to organize our lives around it. I mean, I know my natural propensity is, like, if somebody cuts me off in traffic, I want to go get that SOB. Right? I mean, I even get mad, and I really have to work on this in my spiritual life, when I'm driving down Cleveland and I'm heading towards Jackson, because I live over in that neighborhood. And everybody gets upset on Cleveland because the bike lanes are there and it's too narrow now, and there's only one lane, right? So we're all kind of impatient. Well, there's one light, the way the lights are timed, you're always going to hit the last, second to last red light on Cleveland. It's actually become Watkins by then, I think. So, and there's room on the one side, because there's a bike lane and a right turn lane for people to come up around and then zoom ahead of you. And some of you even run the light. And what I would like to do is kill those people. I know. And that's why I don't buy a gun, right? Among other reasons. But I mean, that internal judgment and hatred, it wells up in me, and I'm like, oh, Dr. King, I'm so far from doing what you and Jesus did. So I have to pray, right? And this is what King is trying to get us to see, is that this is where we need to get to in our personal lives if we have the strength to do that in our political public lives. And you might think, well, I'm never going to get there, so I'm never going to do the political. Now we all muddle along as best we can. But what he's trying to get us to see is that to have confidence in the victory. And that's why he writes about how Good Friday may occupy the throne for a day, but ultimately it must give way to the triumph of Easter. Evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a palace and Christ a cross, but that same Christ rose and split history into AD and BC, so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by his name. See, and that's the power. See, King isn't saying this is just a symbol. There's a real existential power in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So it's not just a symbol, it's a reality, though it is a symbol too. So that's where I'm going to stop. So we have a little time for some questions and commentary. And then next week, I'll do something pretty quick on King's theological anthropology, his view of human. We all sort of starting to get it already. And then we'll talk about Martin and Merton, do a little alliteration. Yes, ma'am.
This is a personal question about
Yeah.
Martin Luther King, and
Uh-huh.
and this has been very revealing, I have to say, this talk today. Of course, I've seen pictures of Martin Luther King with Caucasians who were political figures
Uh-huh.
and things like that. But did he have any close personal friendships with people other than African Americans?
He did. So the person who was very close to him in the Montgomery Bus Boycott was actually a white guy whose name I'm not going to think of right now, but he's from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He's really the one who converted King to nonviolence. Because when King begins the Montgomery Bus Boycott, he is not a disciple of nonviolence. He actually owns a gun.
Probably me.
Yeah, well, so he gets rid of it.
Yeah.
By the end of the bus boycott, he doesn't have a gun anymore. And part of that is the kitchen conversion
Yeah.
experience. He gets this sense that, the only one who really is going to protect me is God.
I'm
And
not there yet.
yeah, I'm kind of trying to get there, but it's, but he learns that in the midst of the struggle, right? Because, what would a gun do if you get blown up in a bomb, right? Your gun gets blown up too. So ultimately, we up our weaponry on both sides. Eventually, we're just going to completely obliterate everybody, which we can kind of see with nuclear weapons. So King did have some close white friends. Though his companion, his closest companions in the struggle were definitely African American, other ministers. And I see this like at Memphis Theological Seminary. There's something about the gathering of Black clergy that there's like this incredible power that's there, people who have shared a life together, that I can sort of look in on, and sometimes I'm invited into, but I'm never going to be part of the inner circle, which is fine. Other questions or things that you might have gleaned from today?
I'm trying hard to put it in today's terms, to think exactly of the situation that I was listening to on the car radio coming in. Present day politics.
Yeah, I think, part of where I kind of go with this is Reverend Barber, who's leading a great movement right now. I think he's the closest to sort of Kingian nonviolence, combined with a strong social movement. So, and the central vision or the central issue that he's working on right now, this movement's working on, is definitely voter rights, which is kind of, isn't it strange? I mean, that was a central issue in 1963. And here we are again. But what happened, of course, is the Supreme Court, several decisions has basically eviscerated the power of the average voter. especially the average African American or person of color voter. So that's where we are. We have to start over in a sense.
It's pretty hard with the Supreme Court.
Well, it is, but there are hopeful things. I mean, and this is where so the legislation can be passed at the federal level that eliminates the Supreme Court, basically, right? In terms of the voting stuff. So we have to make the end run, which is longer and more difficult, but certainly maybe more lasting. And the reality is, and this is where, I mean, in the polls, it's like 80% of people polled when they explain the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It was like, of course, right? So you keep in mind that this anti-voting stuff, it's dead. It's the last desperate attempt from a dying political party. That party's already dead, really. The Republican Party died when Trump became president.
I agree.
And that's, if you're a Republican, you're going to have to find a different political party. I'm not saying you have to become a Democrat. You can't be a Republican anymore because they're not Republicans. They've given up. And that's a dying party because they've hitched their star to the demographics of a United States that in about 5, even in 10 years, they're not going to have any power. And that's why they're so desperate to suppress voting rights. Because they know the demographics, they're not dummies.
I feel so old and helpless now. I didn't feel that way always.
Well, you may be old, right? Right? I mean, everybody in this room, except, 2 guys here, are old, right? I mean, I'll be 65 this summer, relatively young in some people's eyes, but I feel old too. So what do I do, right? I mean, what can we do? We can still write letters or emails, right? But letters are even better. And that may seem like a waste of time with our current senators. I mean, it sure feels like a waste of time for me to write Marsha Blackburn and say, support the Voting Rights Act. She's not going to do it, right? But it's part of our own energy to be able to say, well, at least I did something. And that's important for our own hope, to still write, to still email, make phone calls, and pray. Those are things that most of us can do without leaving our homes. The other thing is, if you have money, you can support organizations that are doing the work. And it doesn't have to be big money. If you combine $20 with 500 people, it starts to add up. But if those 500 people sit on the sidelines and say, well, there's nothing I can do, then those $20 of 500 is not going to happen. And this is, in kind of community organizing, they say the people in power, what do they have? They don't have the people.
They got money.
They got money, right? So what we've got to do is organize our money, right? Because we don't have money by ourselves, most of us, right? But we do have enough money. We can, even a $10 check can make a real difference. I can tell you, just with Manna House, we're not a social movement. We're just a community of hospitality. We live on $20 donations. I mean, most of our donations are $50 or less. We don't have any, we have one big donor once a year, $5,000. That's our biggest donor. And that's not an individual, that's an organization. So we live on the small donors. And most political parties actually live on the small donors when it comes down to it.
Salvation Army, just that little.
That little title out there, right?
And
Yeah. So that's how Barack Obama and his campaigns for presidency, they lived on small donations from multitudes of people. And that's what the powers that be want us to believe that we're powerless, that we're old and tired and can't do anything. And not just people who are actually old. They want 20-year-olds to believe that too, that they're young and powerless and they can't do anything. We do have power. It's because it's not just our power, it's the power of God in our individual lives and in our community life. I mean, that's why we go to church on Sunday, in part, is to be reaffirmed that our personal struggles are not just our personal struggles, they're in the midst of this bigger struggle that is God struggling in human life to redeem us, pull us into the kingdom of God. And we need encouragement. That's why we show up, because we need encouragement. The people who don't show up, I guess they don't need encouragement or they've given up. That's what happens. That's my sermon for today. But I'm with you. I mean, it seems overwhelming. It really, I mean, and my problem is that I get too many emails from too many organizations, right? All who are doing good work. And then I'm like, I'm just not going to support any of them because I can't even decide. So what I've done now is I'm just eliminating a lot of them. And I'm saying I'm going to focus on a few so that I feel like I'm doing something. Because despair, that alienation that Dr. King was writing about, that is the acid that corrodes not only our society, but our souls. And boy, to hang on in hope, especially I think as we move towards the end of our lives, that is hard spiritual work. I mean, I've been really feeling that as like contemporaries of mine start to die, and heroes of mine start to die. Like Thich Nhat Hanh died this past week. It's like, not another one, not another one of my heroes gone. And then I have to look in the mirror and say, well, what's preventing you from being a hero? Now, I'm not going to be Thich Nhat Hanh, but I can live in his path of compassionate peacemaking that he did with I don't know if you remember this, but Thich Nhat Hanh is the guy who was one of the key people who convinced Dr. King to speak out against the war in Vietnam. There's a great picture on the surface this week of them meeting. And also, and we'll talk about this a little bit next week. When King was going to leave Memphis, so after he came to Memphis, he was given a speech and they were going to do a march, and then he was going to go, right? It was one of his typical sort of fly in, do a few things and fly out. You know where he was headed? Merton's Monastery. He was on his way to a retreat with Thomas Merton. And he was assassinated. So he never got there. But see, there's these connections, and they're spiritual connections, and we need them too. That's why we're in church. And we're not going to Merton's Monastery. We're going to Idlewild Presbyterian Church.
We have to go to church.
I know you have to go to church.